Well, Andrew, you said in the previous part that you do sort of suspect that the establishment in the racing industry does look down on us mere mortals, which I think possibly, sadly, is true. But you suspect many in the financial service industry look down on gambling too. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are some notable exceptions there, but I think there is just this differentiation between gambling on things like sport and the kind of rather ivory tower notion of making money from the city and from people who work in the city who take our hard-earned money. And it's always worth remembering that if you give someone your hard-earned £200 a month to invest in in an investment fund, it is your money they're investing, not theirs. Although many people in the financial services space, I think sometimes, if they don't forget it, they don't show enough humility that this is the case. And I think that's very important from us as consumers of financial services products. I think the financial services industry very often tries its best to come up with products that do well by us, but there is just the other thing is I would just like, and this actually applies to bookmakers as well, Simon, as well as banks and large financial institutions. Sometimes I can't be doing with Barclays and its digital eagles, and I can't be doing with Lloyds and its gambling horses down beaches. I just like Barclays to be a bank and do banky things, so that when I go into the branch in Leamington Spa or wherever, it just does what I want it to do. And ditto with bookmakers. I mean, there isn't. I just like bookmakers to be bookmakers sometimes and not be too overly chummy. I just like them to maybe stand a bet and pay out on a bet and treat us as though we're normal human beings. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk just lately about the being knocked back on the Frankie Ackers. But actually, I just wonder, bookmakers have been around long enough. Maybe they could do a bit more to educate the public about what their liabilities are, what it means to be a bookmaker if you are faced with lots of people all wanting the same bet. It's a bit like working in the insurance world. We're all worried about if we take out our car insurance and we have a prang, and then won't we get paid out to the extent that we thought we would do. It's a very sort of one end of the telescope argument. If you understand more about how the insurance world works and how insurance is put together by big companies, they're obviously looking at me as an individual amongst thousands and thousands of individuals. But when I come to claim, my experience is from the other end of the spectrum. So I just think that sometimes, without being there's not always a great room for sentiment in financial services, probably not in bookmaking and indeed punting either. But I just think that bookmakers probably could help themselves a bit more just by making it very clear what they do, and maybe working with race courses, making it clear what they do, rather than standing as kind of maybe maybe an aloof band of people on the rails that occasional race goers kind of see, and a little bit them and us. Maybe a bit more integration, a bit more education wouldn't go amiss on all fronts.
Okay, now you've said you think that UK horse racing is both brilliant and infuriating. That's quite a strong statement.
Yes, it is, isn't it? It is great. And the variety of British horse racing is absolutely fabulous. I think we have to ask ourselves also the question of, is British horse racing and Irish, but I talk mainly from the British perspective. Is British racing in rude health? Not sure about that actually. It would appear to be when we see the big festivals. It would appear to be when we see the big music events and what have you going on, bolted onto race meetings. I would just spin that around on its head actually and say, well, the other weekend we had the Glastonbury Festival, didn't we? And would Glastonbury goers not have gone to Glastonbury on the Friday of Glastonbury had there been a 6-race flat racing card at the bottom of one of those fields? And the answer is, of course they wouldn't. They would have gone for the music, end of. Nowadays, a certain cohort of British racegoers, I think, are having to kind of go to race meetings and almost feel as though they're the rump end of the customer spectrum, because after racing, there's a massive music gig. I think it would be very interesting to find out from somewhere like Newmarket Nights, who have been doing their Friday night music stints for years now. It would be very interesting to know if they think that the customers that go for the music actually then feed back into customers of horse racing going forward. And if they don't, is that then just Newmarket Nights then just there to fill an income gap? Or what is their purpose? I think the sport of horse racing sometimes sells itself very short and forgets what it has got to offer in isolation without having to bring in sort of extracurricular activities, which, while might appeal to a younger racegoer, probably alienates other racegoers and customers on that overall spectrum.
Now, the other thing you talking to me about was race sponsorship. You've got the ump about that a bit. Having been a publisher and although I'm a journalist, I do understand the imperative to make money and the commercials and all that side of the business bridge, if you like. And I think bookmaking down the years has always been probably one step ahead of the sport of horse racing. Which kind of gets my craw a little bit, Simon, if I'm honest. I think, I think race courses are probably sometimes their own worst enemies in terms of the way they have operated with bookmakers. Here's a pot of money from a bookmaker. We'll take that. We'll maybe go down the slightly lazy route of allowing bookmakers to change the name of heritage of races in the race card. And whereas that might shore up my finances for this year and next year, does it do the long-term sport of horse racing a great deal of good? I'm not sure it does. I just wish that someone would put their foot on the ball in this country and say, actually, chaps, this race is called the Stewards Cup, and you can call this race the Stewards Cup, supported by XYZ bookmakers, but that's the race format for that name. Not keep changing and chopping and changing heritage race names for the sake of a bit of sponsorship, which I'm not sure may well be here today, gone tomorrow, and actually doesn't then do the narrative of horse racing any great good in the long run. I have another beef, I'm afraid, slightly about the whole notion of trainers being sponsored by bookmakers, jockeys sponsored by bookmakers, and indeed sort of the whole ambassadorial thing. I have no beef with individual bookmaking firms wanting their pound of flesh in terms of promotion and brand stretching and all the rest of it. That's absolutely fine. That's a given. But being a suspicious old journalist that I am at heart, I always ask myself things. Does this initiative pass the NIF test? And I don't think in the long run these sorts of initiatives do. I can absolutely see why bookmakers do it. I can absolutely see why jockeys and trainers will want to supplement their incomes. But are there cleverer, more innovative ways for race courses and racing as a whole to work with the bookmaking industry to give the bookmakers their pound of exposure, flesh, but do it in slightly more innovative ways? You don't see, for example, do you, race stands? You don't see the Ladbrokes stand at wherever at a racecourse. You don't see certain initiatives where maybe a kind of forward-looking racecourse could say, well, actually, we could do a deal with you, dear bookmaker. We'd love some of your money, but there are other ways we can take your money and give you the brand exposure without necessarily kind of interfering, if you like, with individual jockeys' presence and just leaving that little bit of kind of question mark with the racing public, which in the long term good doesn't necessarily fulfil a great positive. Okay, now you talked about bookmakers a bit there. One thing that the financial industry has that the bookmaking industry doesn't is an ombudsman. Now, you've got some opinions on that?
I have. I wish there was a gambling ombudsman, Simon. I know there is. I'm aware of the Gambling Commission, and actually, I had a quick look at their website the other day just to check. It's quite an interesting thing. There is stuff about complaints on the Commission's website, but ostensibly the impact it gives you is very much would you go gambling with this firm if it was not licensed kind of feel to their website. Now, I come from the financial space, and I scrutinise the money sections, like a hawk, week in, week out. And one thing that's worked very well for the financial press, I think, is in terms of consumer champions, financial agony aunts and uncles who do, the job of I got legged over by an insurance company, or someone won't pay out this, or whatever. And I just wonder actually if the financial press or the press is missing a bit of a gap here in terms of having more of a champion in this space. I appreciate there are some very good work being done by some individuals, especially on Twitter, taking up the cases and taking up cudgels on behalf of disgruntled punters on certain disputes. At the same time, some of the great financial services consumer champions are not averse to saying, "You idiot! Why on earth did you expect to get paid out in compensation from this incident?" And I'm sure, from the bookmaker's perspective, you can reel off a million instances where consumers aren't always in the right. Consumers are more entitled sometimes than they ought to be in terms of what in terms of grievances with bookmakers. And I just think it would be an interesting area to elaborate on. Over time, in the last 20 years, the rise of the financial ombudsman in the financial space for people to go to for dispute resolution, I think has risen. Ombudsman is a very, kind of Victorian or earlier word, and still a bit threatening to people. But I think more and more people are being educated to go to, if they don't get resolution with a dispute with an insurer direct or a bank direct, they can go to the ombudsman. They have this kind of next line of recourse. Wouldn't it be marvellous if there was a gambling ombudsman that could kind of fill that gap in the betting kind of sphere?
Okay, now you can't get off the hook really. You're a journalist, financial journalist, and horse racing journalist. Very briefly, tips for successful investment and punting.
Wow, how many days have you got to answer this? I think the best way to answer the investing thing is personally. Probably one of the most edifying things I've done as in the financial space is I used to chair an investment club of 20 like-minded souls in a pub, each person very egalitarian, very democratic, each putting in their 20 quid a month, and then meeting once a month in the pub to buy a particular share or stock or whatever security. And over time you build up quite a sum of money and you give everyone their say, it's very interesting in those situations, quite close to situations where if person X says, well, actually, I was in Sainsbury's last weekend, they seem to be doing okay by me, I think we should buy Sainsbury's stock. And someone else being maybe a bit more kind of analytical, saying, well, actually, I've got the Sainsbury's report and accounts here, and, it's all, I'm not picking on Sainsbury's, I'm just giving an example, but, I don't see where the prospects are coming from. It's very interesting because actually, in the end, very often people aren't necessarily absolutely right and absolutely wrong. But common sense is a very important ingredient, whether you're making stock market decisions or I think betting on the horses or anything else. I would say if you're investing in the stock market and you're interested in reading company reports and accounts, I would always start from the back page of report and accounts and work from back to front, because if anything's going to be buried, it's going to be buried at the back of a report. I think very often it's interesting to tally reports and accounts with what actually a company is doing, what it says it's doing, and what it's actually doing. I mean, I'm a very privileged person. As a journalist, I can pick up a phone to a broker or to an expert or to whatever and get several experts' views on instant X or potential instant Y. But if we're just in consumer mode, we can't always do that. But we can. There are so many outlets for information now that we're better served than ever before to kind of keep scrutiny on companies and fund managers and all the rest of it. So I think the best thing to do, far more important person to look at in terms of talking common sense, in terms of his investment patterns and strategies in the last 60 plus years, is someone like Warren Buffett, the sage of Omaha, runs Berkshire Hathaway. He's in his 90s now. You can find out a lot of information about what he does. And actually, he talks a very simple, straightforward, pretty sensible game. So if your audience is interested in stock market investing, I would start with the likes of Warren Buffett.
And punting?
And punting. Well, as I say, I think you have to approach punting with the right kind of risk appetite and understand you're not going to make a quick buck. Absolutely not. Or for every person that does, there are 10,000 that don't. So I think it's quite interesting. The punts that I like best are ones. The biggest horse racing that I ever had was on Harzand winning the Derby in 2016, and it was only because the clues were there in terms of I think he'd won the Ballysacks over in Ireland. It was trained by Dermot Weld, owned by the Aga Khan, and yet the price of that horse for from the April through to the Derby in June was very, very elevated. I mean, I think you have to look at, if you get an understanding of where trainers target their horses year in, year out, when they're, you get an understanding of what they think the horses are like. It might give you a chance of kind of latching on to the ride. So Harzand and Pourmois in the Derby, was it 2013 or whenever? Pourmois won the Prix Greffule in France, I think, but was a 12-1 shot in a 6-runner race, although it was owned by Magnier and Co. So I think the Prix Greffule is a kind of a identifiable Derby trial over there. But it struck me at the time that the prices for those horses were far and away above what they probably would be if they rocked up for the Derby. So it was worth having a punt on them. Obviously, one couldn't be sure until the day, and I think the rains came in time for Harzand. But I think that was factored into the price. So I'm afraid, folks, there's no escape for kind of getting used to pricing stuff up, getting a kind of a feel for the more granular stuff. I think knowing your form, doing a bit of data crunching, it can't hurt, can it?
Brilliant, Andrew, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you.